The tall bamboo fences stood around long rows of tin-roofed barracks, while the heavy rain of the monsoon beat on the metal walls and sounded like the soft cries of many women, Dutch, British, Filipino, Chinese, and sometimes American, who were captured by the Imperial Japanese Army. In this dark place of Southeast Asia during World War II, every day was full of pain, fear, and trying to survive. The guards walked through the camps strict in their orders, but often cruel in their actions. The women kept their eyes down, their heads bowed, their tears silent during every roll call, every work order, every short talk at night. Near these camps, other women called comfort. Women were taken from their homes, schools, and families, and kept in places the Japanese military made for men. Testimonies later showed how they were forced to be with 10, 20, or even 40 men, each day beaten if they said no, and their families threatened if they tried to run. They were denied hope, kindness, or healing, and the deep wounds inside and outside stayed for many years. In the prison camps, the women lived every moment scared of being hurt. The rules were harsh. Looking a guard in the eye meant getting hit. Forgetting to bow could mean being slapped so. Hard teeth broke. At Tenko morning and evening roll call, they had to stand still for hours in hot sun or heavy rain, with shaved heads showing punishment, and their hands pressed to their clothes, as pride of the empire demanded. Hunger hurt their body, sickness spread fast, and each whisper of coming battles filled them with both hope and fear. On some rare nights, whispers spread through the camp. The Allies were coming. American soldiers, loud, bold, and different, were getting closer. Their tanks and jeeps pushed through the jungles and rice fields. The women feared the worst. After so many years of pain, hunger, and cruelty, they expected the same abuse again, maybe even worse. They remembered old stories about armies taking women by force, and many who were never seen again. But when morning came and the gates opened, silence filled the camp as the American soldiers stepped into the sunlight. They held their guns low, spoke quietly, and gave clear orders. There was no shouting, no chaos, no hits. The first steps were gentle and unsure. American medics walked among the women, giving food, treating their wounds, and speaking softly, handing them blankets and small bits of comfort. No one lifted a hand in anger or harm. They never touched us, not once, became a line written again and again in the diaries of Dutch, Filipino, British, and American women. Some survivors said they could not believe it. Their bodies tensed, waiting for pain that never came. Their minds expected rape, or more work, or cruel words. Instead, the Americans looked down respectfully, called them ma'am, and even said sorry for what they had been through. The sudden feeling of respect, safety, and control was so strong that many women did not cry until days later, when they finally knew the nightmare was really over. When those first American uniforms appeared, hope and fear both filled the hearts of Dutch, British, Australian, Filipino, and Chinese prisoners. In every women's camp, the same scene happened. Gates opened, strange trucks and jeeps made loud sounds, and men shouted orders in English. The freeing of Bangka Island, Sumatra, Batavia, Burma, and the Philippines came only days after Japan gave up. Margaret Dryburgh wrote in her journal from Sumatra about this shocking change. For all the women, even those too broken to understand it, felt unreal to see no abuse, no forced marches, no angry words. They gave us chocolate, washed our children, and left us in peace. Records from Batavia showed the same thing. Many women expected more pain and cruelty, because that was all they had known. Instead, the American soldiers asked before entering, carried food and medicine, and never touched any woman unless to help the hurt or the babies. A Dutch woman said it felt strange because so much gentleness after years of violence was almost scary in its kindness. All across the lands the same stories appeared. Filipino women like Narcisisa, Cleveria, and Fidencia David, who had been attacked every night in Japanese camps, found that the American and Australian soldiers treated them with care and respect, not as things to take away. The Japanese had built brothels and forced women to serve, but the Allied camps brought food safety and, after checking for sickness, helped families come back together. British prisoners from Singapore and Burma remembered being chained, beaten, and torn from their children before. The day the Allied forces arrived became the day the rules ended. They were called by their names again and could speak freely. Barbara Combs, from the Sumatra camp, wrote about the moment of shock and crying, when they knew they would not be hurt or broken again. German and American Red Cross workers who came with the army saw women still shaking with fear, crying during medical checks, and needing weeks to believe that the cruel Japanese rule was really finished. Allied soldiers often found it hard to comfort the survivors. One medic said it took days before any woman spoke to them like they were real people, because many months of fear had made deep distrust. But with each meeting and each gentle act, the women started to feel a little safe again. The stories from the freed comfort houses were even more shocking. Korean, Chinese, and Filipino girls. Some still teenagers thought they would be killed by the Japanese, or attacked again when the soldiers came. Instead, the American and Commonwealth soldiers gave them food and simple medical help. The pain stayed, but the fact that no one hurt them again was the beginning of healing. Later, some survivors helped build memorials and shared their stories, ending years of silence. In some camps, officers held real freedom ceremonies. Flags were raised, names written down, and teams came with kind words instead of weapons. It was not only a rescue, but a sign of respect. Letters saved by the Far East. Prisoners of war group told the same story. They never touched us. They asked about our families. For the first time, I felt human again. Being saved did not mean being healed. Living through slavery and fear left marks that lasted for life. Many women said the sudden kindness felt almost as strong as the pain had been. The soldiers did not always know what the women had suffered, and many women stayed silent for years, afraid no one would believe them. But diaries and later talks proved the same truth: relief, surprise, and a slow return to feeling alive again. The word spread through camps as quiet rumors, as small bits of hope. When American soldiers reached those freed areas, the shock was deep, not just because the cruelty was gone, but because people started to feel human again. Korean women freed from comfort houses in China remembered the moment when U.S. and Chinese soldiers led them out of dark caves and broken houses and gave them blankets, clean water, and their first piece of fresh bread in many years. Survivors like Park Young-sim and Oki stood frozen as soldiers cried when they saw their wounds and fearful faces. The size of the American rescue was huge. In 1944 and 1945, Signal Corps photographers and search teams found almost 2,000 comfort stations across Burma, China, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and Okinawa. Medical teams rushed in to treat sickness, hunger, and injuries. They found women weak from hunger, covered in untreated wounds, and still suffering from abuse. Reports from the Office of War Information said Army medics cared for up to 50 freed women at one time in small tents beside battlefields. U.S. Army nurse Elizabeth Kinn said they expected pain and flinched whenever a man came close, but none of our men ever broke the trust we wanted to rebuild. In every look I saw fear then, for a moment hope. The survivors told how Japanese soldiers tried to kill them or force them to run into the mountains when defeat was near. Sometimes Allied soldiers arrived only hours later, finding wounded women and children with no food and no hope. In many camps, the American rule was simple: record help, protect soldiers. Took thousands of photos and written reports that later became powerful evidence when survivors finally spoke in the 1990s in the Philippines, as American and Filipino fighters freed towns. Women like Maria Rosa Henson, only 17, thin and weak from prison, remembered the day the gates opened. The soldiers talked softly, stayed at a distance, and cried with them. I waited for pain but felt only kindness, she said. Even when guards tried to hide the truth or push women on death marches, American officers stopped them, gave orders for medical care, clean places to rest, and kept the women safely away from male soldiers. Stories like these were also told by Dutch and British prisoners in Sumatra and Java. Margaret Dryburgh wrote that when the Dutch army took back West Java, they made sure every woman's name and treatment were recorded to keep their dignity, even in the middle of chaos and sickness. Interviews years later showed that what shocked many women most was not just being freed, but being treated like people again, after living so long like they were worth nothing. Medical teams faced huge problems: hunger, sickness, infection, and open wounds. But the Americans followed strict rules. No soldier touched a woman unless it was needed for care. Every act of help came with respect. Doctors and nurses wrote down what they saw, knowing the truth must be saved for history. Photos taken by U.S. Army workers became key proof in war crime trials, and were still used many years later by people fighting for justice, for comfort, women. But freedom did not bring peace right away. Many survivors felt fear for months. Some were scared of being hurt again or shamed by their families. In Korea and China, many women stayed silent for most of their lives. It took bravery and slow truth, telling in news meetings, government hearings, and world courts, to finally get their stories heard and prove the promise the Allies tried to keep, but could not finish alone. For the American and Allied soldiers, what they saw changed them forever. Army guides, medical reports, and talks with officers later showed that self-control was not just a moral choice, but something learned through mistakes in other wars. The rule of never touched became a lasting example, a standard for how soldiers should act, and it shaped how the United States and its allies worked in later wars like Korea, Vietnam, and peace missions around the world. Even as time passed, the pain stayed in the stories told by survivors. Okuni shared her memories in the 1990s, long after she was freed. She said every day was fear, then one day was not. I thought I had died, but I lived to tell my story. Park Young-sim stood before the Women's International War Crimes Tribunal and said, "In freedom I was believed. That helped me heal the silence. After freedom was not real peace. It was only the start of a long fight to get back their dignity, justice, and truth. The slow road to freedom was not an ending, but the beginning of many years filled with both quiet and remembrance." Women freed from comfort houses in China. Korea and the Dutch East Indies were finally safe, but inside they were broken. Their bodies carried cuts, deafness from beatings and old pain. Their nights were full of bad dreams and shame, even while Allied doctors gave them food, shelter, and care. Many were saved only days after Japanese soldiers tried to kill them to hide the crimes or stop them from speaking. In one camp near Beijing, Korean women were almost murdered before Chinese and American soldiers arrived. Their calm actions saved lives and allowed the truth to be told many years later. Doctors and Red Cross teams worked for months, fixing wounds, setting bones, curing infections, and feeding the starving. In Shanghai, medical staff cared for women who, for the first time in years, no longer feared that every pain meant more abuse. Nurses moved slowly and spoke gently, always explaining what they were doing and asking permission, because they knew even a small act of respect could help the women start to heal. But when many survivors went back home, they still faced great struggles because of shame, no help from governments, and strict rules in their communities. Many comfort women, Dutch prisoners, and others had to hide their stories. Park Young-sim was almost rejected by neighbors who thought she was dirty. Margaret Dryburgh and other women in Sumatra and Java described long, quiet times after being freed, using only music and writing to help with their sadness. In countries like Korea and the Philippines, Survivors moved between police offices, hospitals, and temporary shelters. Some organizations, missionaries, and a few allied officials tried to help. Women find their families and give legal advice, but most governments did not give lasting help. Later, human rights workers collected stories in books, documentaries, and court hearings, finally letting the world hear what had been hidden under post-war politics. Remembering injustice came slowly. In the 1990s and 2000s, international courts, UN groups, and world media began to show Japanese war crimes and recognize the suffering and strength of comfort. Women and other female prisoners. Court hearings in Tokyo and testimonies in Washington pointed out how American soldiers acted with care as an example of good wartime behavior, showing that saving people does not need violence. Survivor stories became part of the world's memory. Women like Yongsui Okuni and many others were honored in memorials, conferences, and lessons. Their repeated message that American soldiers never touched them and never broke the trust given at liberation became a key teaching for future generations about war ethics and the importance of rescue. Years after being freed, women formed support groups, asked for reparations, and shared their stories in documentaries. One former prisoner wrote, "We were broken, but they gave us a chance to heal medical records." Letters and memoirs marked each step. First food, first gentle words. First sleep without fear. The quiet that followed was not real peace, but the start of memory justice, and the long journey to regain dignity.